storyteller tells a slightly strange story about a tough bear, a soaring eagle, a PC idea, meaning both Peace Corps-ish and politically correct, and a fuller, better investment in a world that wishes it could spend more bucks drinking and dancing with Lady Harmony. Please welcome Dwayne Hunn with Could a Boxer Tame a Growling Bear and a Biting Eagle?
Before they turned the lights off, I saw those Trumpite placards up in the expensive balcony seats. So I figured this audience knows that Marin County is one of the richest counties in the nation. The Trumpites probably don't know that Mrs. Buck was one of the richest women in Marin County because her husband, who passed in 1953, left his Belridge oil assets in her Buck Trust. And the stipulation in that trust was that it could only be spent in Marin. Some years later, a couple years later, in the mid-'80s, Oakland's attorneys tried to raid the Buck Trust by attacking that stipulation, saying there were communities in Oakland and San Francisco who needed it much more than NIMBY-ish Marin County needed what was valued recently at $1 billion trust. So those golden attorneys up at the Marin Frank Lloyd Wright Civic Center Castle, they responded by putting a stipulation in the Buck Trust will that said, we're going to spend money on 3 major projects that will benefit all of mankind, not just NIMBY-ish Marinites. Now, when I was in high school, I flunked a class titled Understanding God. Simple concept, the Jesuits wanted me to master it, so they required me to go to summer school. And sometimes during the school year, they tried to help me additionally by sending me to JUG. JUG is a pedagogical Jesuit acronym for Justice Under God. And it basically amounted to an after-school scholarly detention camp. I did some of those. All of those, I felt, prepared me very well to compete for these grants because I knew those chapters, I had memorized those chapters on bettering mankind in the religious textbooks to pass the course. So we submitted a proposal. Our grant proposal was this. We proposed that you go to the World College West and spend some Buck Trust money on setting up a camp that would have 50 Peace Corps volunteers come and train for 3 months, and we get 50 Soviets to come and train for 3 months with them. At the end of 3 months, those 100 Peace Corps and Soviets would go and serve together in the same country, the same village. They'd live together, they'd work together, maybe they'd commingle or scramble their capitalistic and commie beliefs. And after they did that 40 or 50,000 times, we figured there'd be no danger of the 2 giant nations in the world raining bombs on each other. There'd be too many friendships, too many connections, too many late-night humorous vodka and beer bouts. So things would be taken care of. Well, we did pretty well. We got into the playoffs for the Buck Trust grant. But the money bequeathers at the Buck Trust decided that it wasn't to be, we were not to be one of the 3. Now, aside from religious problems, I've always had problems understanding when to hang up my cleats. So I kept running these bases, trying to get a Soviet-American Peace Corps going. I wrote op-eds, I wrote to the Soviet consulate, I wrote to Congresswoman Boxer, I did some television public affairs shows, I went on, and nothing seemed to be happening. Then one day, a group on a Saturday or Sunday with a title like Beyond War had this public meeting in the city, and their guest speaker was to be the Deputy Consul General Sergei Avazian. I went. In the crowd of about 150, I was one of those people whose hand he called on. And I explained the American-Soviet Peace Corps to him, and I said, what do you think the Soviet Union might think about this? As I'm explaining it, he's getting up from his seat, and he goes, Dun Hunn, you! And being more confused than I normally am, which is considerable, I said, I'm Dwayne Hunn. And he says, you stay, no go, you stay, we talk. Okay? Okay with me. It was the start of a wonderful friendship. Sergey took me to the Soviet consulate on Green Street. They opened these steel-lined, lead-lined doors that are about this thick and are really steel. They took me into this really nice room with a lot of red chairs and pictures of bears on the wall. And the consul general came out, and I met him and a bunch of other nice people. It was a wonderful afternoon. The next day, which I think was a Saturday, there was one little card in my mailbox. Robert Ghost, telephone number in 3 letters. FBI. I'm assuming you don't think that's the Farting and Burping Institute. Well, my next work day, which was Monday, Robert Ghost appeared. And we spent 2+ hours in our meeting room at the Affordable Housing Development Office where I worked. And during those 2+ hours and afterwards, I learned several things. One, the Snoops thought that the Russians had, and you can see it, a shack on the top of that Green Street consulate house. And they were quite sure that that shack on the roof was sending encoded messages back and forth. They were also quite sure that the top snoop on the West Coast was Sergey Avayazan. When I asked Sergey what he did with his days, he said, I read a lot of periodicals and many newspapers, and I write up reports, and I send it back to the Soviet Union. Sergey was not allowed to go within 10 miles of Hamilton Air Force Base, dilapidated Hamilton Air Force Base that had not had jets land on it since the 70s. Sergey was, well, on a Saturday, Sergey and his wife, Sergey was teaching his kid how to do karate. Now, when you met this kid, he was 7 years old, gentle, sweet, almost effeminate. When I asked him why, he said, because Russia's streets are mean, and I want my kid to be ready for those mean streets when he goes home. On a Saturday, I had Sergey, his wife and his son, Clark, his wife and his 7-year-old daughter, and my buddy Ray do a barbecue in my backyard. I have a well-fortified, it's fenced, it's covered with ivy, it's got a latch gate, it's got a narrow pathway. When I'm doing a barbie in the backyard, nobody can see what's going on. While we're doing the barbie and Ray is doing the grill, around the corner comes 2 buff guys, really buff guys, in t-shirts. One flips out his wallet and he says, I'm with the Children's Garden and we wondered if you'd like to make a charitable contribution. As the other one's head is doing this radar beacon thing with the yard and Sergey and his family, and he's checking everything out. And as they leave, Ray comes over from the Barbie. He walks up to me, he rolls his eyes, and he said, you know, you could do a fuller, better investment or an FBI elsewhere. Now, with that, Congressman Boxer, about this time, starts doing some wonderful and visionary things. And I'm going to read you from a couple letters, just some sections from 2 of the letters. They're at the website, peopleslobby.us, but Will kind of pushed me in this direction. We'll blame it on Will. November of 1984. Thank you for your extensive and interesting proposal on the methods for waging peace in our foreign policy. As you know, I am deeply committed to the cause of peace and disarmament, and was particularly intrigued by some of the alternatives you suggest. Reviving the Peace Corps as a priority is an especially good idea. Your concept of challenging the Russians to replace 100,000 of their armed forces with a Peace Corps to match 100,000 volunteers of our own is a very exciting idea. Clearly, we need innovative and dedicated approaches to stopping the arms race. Making the U.S. and USSR our rivals in peace efforts is a change we need to promote. 4 years later, there were some other letters in between, but 4 years later she writes, I have in fact given the subject further thought, and I plan to introduce the enabling legislation. I apologize if you perceive us to be moving slowly, but I assure you it is only a function of the legislation and concomitant workload to which we have already committed for this session, and not the lack of enthusiasm for your proposal. I am also of the mind that the initial program should be directed at work projects in the U.S. and the USSR, rather than leading fully from the start into third world development. I believe doing it this way would simplify the initial organizational and logistical challenge, leave more room for the massaging of any problems which arise, and keep the program more directly in the public eye. This would allow public awareness and support for this program to grow. Now, I wonder if you could think of any better and cheaper way to wage peace than in this manner. Now, the history of all this is at, as I said, the People's Lobby website, as is the American World Service Corps National Service Proposal, which would put 1 million Americans a year into national service. And part of the elements of that congressional proposal is to have joint Peace Corps like the Russian and American Peace Corps. Now, as the doomsday clock 2016 roars toward 3 minutes before midnight and my story jam clock is running out, I'm going to say I hope you do something more than carry Trump placards around. And if any of you know any Russians, maybe you could ask them to snoop around for Sergei Aviazan, because the Radio Shack on my roof no longer is in touch with him, and I can't find him. So I hope some of you would snoop around and find this top snoop. Thank you.